Disappear like a king. She'll regret losing you. Stoicism. There is a particular silence that unsettles people more than any argument ever could. It is the silence of a man who simply stops explaining himself. He does not slam doors. He does not raise his voice. He does not beg for one more chance. He simply turns and walks toward his own life, and never looks back to check if she noticed. This is the silence the ancients understood better than we do today. Marcus Aurelius, ruling an empire while burying friends and enduring betrayal after betrayal, wrote to himself in the quiet of his tent that the best revenge is to not be like your enemy. He did not mean passivity. He meant something far more dangerous to those who wronged him: complete indifference, dressed as dignity. A king does not chase what walks away from him. A king builds a kingdom so magnificent that anyone who leaves it spends the rest of their life quietly aware of what they gave up. This is not a video about winning her back. This is a video about becoming a man so whole, so sovereign, so at peace with his own worth, that walking away from you becomes the single greatest miscalculation of her life. If that is the man you are ready to become, subscribe to Quotes Library now, because everything I am about to teach you will only work if you apply it, and I want you standing here with us when you do. Let me tell you about a man named Julian Cross. Julian was 34 years old when Adaise left him. She did not leave violently. She left the way modern departures often happen, with a long conversation about growth and needs and timing, words that sound reasonable and still land like a blade between the ribs. Julian did what most men do. He called. He texted paragraphs at midnight explaining himself, defending himself, promising to change into whatever shape she required. He drove past her apartment twice, telling himself it was coincidence. He asked mutual friends what she was saying about him, hungry for any scrap of information that might tell him whether there was still a door open somewhere. Every one of these actions communicated the same message to Adaise, though he never intended it: I have nothing left without you. I am incomplete. You hold my value in your hands. And the tragic irony, the one Julian would only understand months later, is that desperation is the fastest way to confirm someone's decision to leave, because nothing frightens a person more than realizing they have become another person's entire foundation. It took Julian 61 days of silence, agony, and deliberate reconstruction of his own identity before he understood a truth so simple it embarrassed him. He had spent the relationship slowly disappearing into her, sanding down his own edges to fit more comfortably into her life, and somewhere in that process he had become a man not worth staying for, not because he lacked value, but because he had stopped showing it. This is the story we will return to throughout this video, because Julian's transformation is not fictional flattery. It is the blueprint. Every principle you are about to hear, he lived through, often clumsily, often too late for that particular relationship, but never too late for the next chapter of his life. Stay with me, because by the end of this, you will understand exactly how a man disappears not out of anger, but out of self-respect, and why that disappearance becomes the loudest thing he has ever done. Principle 1. Silence is a throne, not a punishment. Most men misunderstand silence. They use it as a weapon, a sulking withdrawal meant to provoke guilt, a childish hope that if they simply stop responding, she will come crawling back in panic. This is not silence. This is manipulation wearing silence as a costume, and people can feel the difference instantly. Real silence, the kind Marcus Aurelius practiced in his private writings, is not directed at anyone. It requires no audience. It is not performed for her benefit, hoping she notices your absence and suffers accordingly. It is simply the natural result of a man who has turned his attention inward, toward his own reconstruction, and no longer has spare energy to perform outrage or grief for public consumption. Epictetus taught his students that some things are within our control and some things are not, and the moment you accept that her choices, her feelings, her decision to stay or leave, exist entirely outside your control, the noise in your mind begins to quiet. You stop rehearsing arguments you will never get to have. You stop drafting messages you will delete before sending. The throne of silence is built from this acceptance, not from spite. Julian's first mistake was mistaking loud absence for strength. He would go silent for 3 days, then break, sending a message disguised as casual but soaked in desperation. Each cycle taught Adaise the same lesson. His silence had a price, and if she waited long enough, he would pay it. Real silence has no price tag because it is not a negotiation tactic. It is simply what a man does when he redirects his entire attention toward the one relationship that will outlast every romantic one he ever has, the relationship with himself. When you stop narrating your pain to anyone who might report it back to her, When you stop leaving digital breadcrumbs designed to be discovered, your silence becomes unreadable, and unreadable men are unforgettable. She cannot predict a king who has stopped performing for her audience. That unpredictability, born from genuine peace rather than strategic withholding, is the first and most powerful throne you will ever sit on. There is also a harder truth hidden inside this principle, one Julian resisted for weeks before he finally accepted it. Silence only becomes a throne once you stop needing her to witness you sitting on it. If some corner of your mind is still calculating how your absence will read to her, still hoping word travels back through some chain of mutual friends, you have not yet built the throne. You have only built a stage, and stages require an audience to mean anything. Epictetus taught his students to examine their impressions before acting on them, to ask honestly whether a desire came from wisdom or from attachment to something outside their control. Julian began applying this same scrutiny to his own silence, asking himself each morning whether his quiet was genuine or performative. The honest answer took time to arrive at consistently, but the asking itself was the discipline. A throne built on genuine indifference to her audience cannot be shaken by anything she does or does not do, because it was never built to withstand her reaction in the first place. It was built to hold him. Principle 2. A king does not audit his worth through someone who left. There is a particular kind of self-destruction that happens when a man treats the person who left him as the final judge of his value. He replays the relationship searching for the moment he became insufficient. He interrogates every conversation for evidence of his own inadequacy. He essentially hands the departed person a gavel and asks them to rule, again and again, on whether he deserves to feel whole. This is backwards. Seneca wrote extensively about the danger of outsourcing our peace to external opinions, warning that the man who needs the approval of others to feel secure will never truly rest, because approval is inconsistent, conditional, and ultimately outside his control. Adaisa's departure was information about her needs, her timing, her capacity in that particular season of her life. It was never a verdict on Julian's worth as a human being, though for weeks he treated it exactly like one. The shift happened for Julian during an ordinary Tuesday morning when he caught himself, mid-shower, still rehearsing a defense for something she had said 3 weeks earlier, a defense she would never hear, built entirely for an audience that had already left the theater. He realized in that moment that he had been living inside a courtroom of his own construction, prosecuting himself daily for a verdict nobody but him was reading. Diogenes lived without possessions, without status, without the approval of Athenian society, and was famously more content than kings who had everything except command of their own minds. Julian began asking a different question, not, was I enough for her, but, am I building a life I actually respect? The first question has no honest answer because it depends entirely on someone else's perception. The second question is answerable every single day, through actions only you control. A king does not audit his worth through a former subject. He audits it through his own conduct, measured against his own standards, and he lets that be sufficient. If this reframing is helping you see your own situation differently, take 30 seconds and subscribe to Quotes Library. This channel exists specifically to hand men frameworks like this one, ancient wisdom translated into language you can actually use on a Tuesday morning in the shower, and we release new material regularly for exactly the version of you that is rebuilding right now. Principle 3. Rebuild the body before you rebuild anything else. Philosophy without physiology is fragile. A man can recite every Stoic principle from memory and still crumble if his body is depleted, sleepless, and chemically starved from weeks of stress eating and isolation. The ancients were not disconnected minds floating above their bodies. Marcus Aurelius rode with his legions. Seneca walked daily as a discipline of clear thought. The body was never separate from the philosophy, it was the vessel that made the philosophy sustainable. When a man is discarded, the temptation is to collapse inward, to stop training, to stop eating with intention, to stop sleeping on any kind of schedule, because grief convinces him that discipline is now pointless. This is precisely backwards. Discipline becomes more essential during collapse, not less, because the body is the first place self-respect becomes visible, both to yourself and eventually to everyone who sees you again after time apart. Julian's second month of separation looked nothing like his first. Where the first month was fueled by silent phones checked obsessively and skipped meals replaced by whatever was fastest, the second month became structured, almost militant. He trained at 5 in the morning before his mind had the chance to spiral. He cooked meals instead of ordering them, not out of vanity but because the ritual of preparing food for himself was, in its own small way, an act of self-respect. He began sleeping at consistent hours, and within 3 weeks noticed his thinking had sharpened considerably, his emotional reactivity had softened, and a strange, unfamiliar calm had settled into his chest that he had not felt in over a year, even while he was still in the relationship. This is the truth almost nobody tells men. Physical discipline does not just change how you look. It changes the entire chemistry of how you process loss. A well-rested, well-trained, well-nourished man simply does not spiral the same way a depleted one does. Build the vessel first. Everything else becomes easier to carry. There is a reason ancient armies trained their bodies as rigorously as they trained their minds for battle. A general who cannot control his own physical impulses, his hunger, his fatigue, his craving for comfort, will struggle to command anything larger than himself. Julian noticed this parallel directly in his own life. The mornings he skipped training were the same mornings his mind wandered back toward old messages and unanswered questions. The mornings he trained, even briefly, even poorly, gave him a small, undeniable victory to carry into the rest of his day, evidence that he was still capable of choosing discipline over collapse. This is not about vanity or aesthetics, though those often improve as a side effect. It is about proving to yourself, in a tangible and repeatable way, that you still command your own choices even when your emotional life feels entirely out of your hands. A body in motion, fed with intention and rested on a schedule, becomes the daily proof that the kingdom is still under construction, regardless of what she is doing on the other side of the silence. Principle 4. Speak less, reveal less, become more mysterious by simply living. There is an old piece of wisdom, sometimes attributed to strategic thinkers like Machiavelli, that power is often lost the moment it is explained. A man who narrates his every move, who announces his growth, who posts obvious proof of his thriving specifically for an ex-partner to witness, has revealed his hand. He has told the world, and told her, that her opinion still matters enough to perform for. True transformation does not need an audience to validate it. Machiavelli understood that perception is often more powerful than reality in the eyes of others, but he also understood that manufactured perception collapses the moment it is discovered to be manufactured. The most convincing transformation is the one nobody sees you working on, because it was never built for spectators in the first place. Julian made this mistake early, posting gym photos with captions just vague enough to be obviously aimed at a daze, checking obsessively who had viewed them, refreshing his own posts like a man waiting for a verdict. It took him embarrassingly long to notice that this behavior was simply the old desperation wearing new, more athletic clothing. The turning point came when he stopped posting entirely for 6 weeks, not from suppression, but because he genuinely no longer felt the pull to perform. He was training because training felt good. He was reading because reading expanded him. He was building a small consulting side venture because the work itself was satisfying, not because he needed anyone to witness it. Word reached him eventually, through the same mutual friends who once carried his desperate questions, that Adaze had asked what he had been up to, and had seemed unsettled by how little anyone actually knew. The less you reveal, the more room you leave for people to wonder, and wondering is a far more powerful hook than any curated proof of your success could ever be. Principle 5. Detach the outcome, attach only to the discipline. Epictetus built his entire philosophy around a single dividing line. Some things are up to us, and some things are not. Our judgments, our efforts, our discipline, our responses, these belong to us entirely. Other people's feelings, decisions, and timelines belong entirely to them. The moment Julian understood this was not the moment he stopped caring about Adaze. It was the moment he stopped attaching his piece to whether or not she came back. He began pouring his energy into the disciplines themselves, the training, the reading, the rebuilding of his finances, the deepening of his friendships, treating each one as valuable regardless of whether she ever noticed or returned. This detachment is often mistaken for coldness, but it is the opposite. It is the only honest form of self-respect available to a man in his position, because chasing an outcome he cannot control would have required him to abandon the only thing he actually could control, which was who he was becoming during the waiting. There is a particular freedom that arrives when a man genuinely releases his grip on the outcome. Julian described it later as the difference between running toward a finish line that keeps moving further away, and simply running because running had become who he was. If she returned, wonderful, he would evaluate that reality when it arrived, with clear eyes rather than desperate ones. If she did not, the man he had built in her absence was still someone he respected, still someone with momentum, still someone whose mornings had structure and whose nights had peace. This is what the philosophers meant when they spoke of the dichotomy of control. Not indifference to outcomes, but refusal to let outcomes you cannot govern dictate the quality of the effort you can govern completely. Attached to the discipline, let the outcome arrive on its own schedule. This kind of detachment is often confused with pretending not to care, but the two are entirely different postures. Pretending not to care is exhausting, because it requires constant internal suppression of feelings that are still very much present. Genuine detachment from outcome is not suppression at all, it is redirection. Julian still cared deeply about what had happened between them. He simply stopped assigning that care the job of determining his daily mood or his sense of self. Seneca compared the well-ordered mind to a calm harbor, unaffected by the storms happening on the open sea, not because the sailor does not notice the storm, but because he has built something sturdy enough to withstand it without being tossed around by every wave. Julian's discipline became his harbor. Some days the old feelings returned in full force, unexpected and sharp, and on those days he simply returned to the disciplines he could control, a workout, a page of reading, a conversation with a friend, until the storm passed on its own. This is the quiet, unglamorous work of detachment, not the absence of feeling, but the refusal to let feeling steer the ship. If you have made it this far, you are exactly the kind of person this channel was built for, someone willing to sit with difficult ideas long enough to actually apply them. Subscribe to Quotes Library so you never miss the next principle, the next story, the next piece of ancient wisdom translated for the life you are actually living right now. Principle 6. Rebuild your circle before you rebuild anything else. Social isolation is the silent killer of a man's recovery. When Julian withdrew from a daze, he unintentionally withdrew from almost everyone else too, canceling plans, declining invitations, convincing himself that solitude was healing when in reality it had curdled into avoidance. The Stoics were not hermits. Marcus Aurelius surrounded himself with advisors and generals. Seneca wrote letters constantly to a close friend, using that friendship as a place to think out loud and be challenged. Community was never optional in Stoic practice, it was considered essential scaffolding for a well-examined life. A man who isolates himself during heartbreak is a man who hands his own mind an echo chamber, where every insecure thought bounces back amplified, unchecked by any outside perspective. Julian's real recovery began the week he forced himself back into his old Sunday basketball group, the one he had quietly abandoned 3 months earlier under the excuse of being busy. Those 2 hours of movement and unfiltered friendship did something no amount of solitary journaling had managed. His friends did not tiptoe around his situation. They teased him, challenged him, reminded him who he had been before the relationship consumed his calendar and his identity. This is a truth few men want to hear. Your friendships did not pause while you were in a relationship, and they will not automatically resume the moment you need them. They require the same deliberate investment you once poured into her. A king does not rule alone. He is surrounded by a council, people who know him well enough to call out his self-pity and celebrate his genuine progress. Rebuild that council. It will carry weight your solitary thoughts never could. There is also a quieter benefit to community that few men consider during heartbreak. Perspective borrowed from people who are not emotionally entangled in your situation. When Julian described his lingering doubts to his brother, a man with no stake in whether a daze ever returned, he received a clarity his own spiraling thoughts could never produce. His brother simply asked him whether he would want to date the version of himself he had been in the final months of the relationship, anxious, distracted, constantly checking his phone. Julian's honest answer, no, became a turning point sharper than any amount of solitary journaling had managed. Seneca wrote to his friend Lucilius precisely because he understood that even a wise man benefits from a second perspective, a witness who can see blind spots invisible from the inside. Your counsel does not need to be large. It needs to be honest. Even 2 or 3 people who will tell you the truth instead of what you want to hear are worth more than 100 followers cheering your curated recovery from a distance. Principle 7. Let time do what explanation never could. There is a peculiar arrogance in believing you can talk someone into missing you. Words, no matter how carefully chosen, cannot manufacture longing. Longing is produced by absence, by the slow, quiet accumulation of days during which a person notices the shape of what is missing from their life. Julian spent his first weeks trying to explain his way back into relevance, and every explanation only confirmed to days that he was still available, still reachable, still hoping. It was only when he stopped explaining entirely that time was finally allowed to do its work. Seneca observed that we suffer more in imagination than in reality, and much of Julian's early suffering came from imagining conversations that would fix everything, conversations that, had he actually had them, would likely have changed nothing. Months passed. Julian did not track them waiting for a reaction from a daze. He tracked them the way a man tracks the growth of something he is actually building, watching his savings account grow, watching his body change, watching his consulting work gain small but real traction. Somewhere around month 5, a mutual acquaintance mentioned, almost in passing, that a daze had brought him up unprompted, wondering aloud who the version of him she now heard about actually was. Julian felt something interesting in that moment. Not triumph, not vindication, but a kind of quiet acknowledgement that time, left alone to do its work without his interference, had communicated more than any message he could have crafted. This is the principle so few men trust, because it requires the one thing modern instant communication has trained out of us: patience without monitoring. Let time speak. It is a far more persuasive narrator than you are. Patience without monitoring is harder than it sounds, because monitoring has become almost invisible in modern life. Checking a profile, noticing who liked what, calculating meaning from a story posted at a certain hour. All of this feels passive, almost accidental, yet it keeps a man tethered to a person he claims to be releasing. Julian eventually removed himself from these small daily temptations entirely, not through willpower alone but through structural change, muting notifications, deleting saved conversations, removing the easy paths back into surveillance. This was not avoidance. It was a deliberate architectural decision, the same way a general removes a bridge his own troops might be tempted to retreat across. Marcus Aurelius wrote that we should confine ourselves to the present, since that alone is truly ours to lose. Every moment spent monitoring her digital footprint was a moment stolen from the only life Julian actually had authority over, his own. Time cannot do its quiet work of building longing and reflection in her mind if you are constantly checking whether it has started working yet. Remove the bridge. Let the distance become real. Principle 8. Become the man even loneliness cannot diminish. The final transformation, the one that actually made Julian a king rather than simply a man performing recovery, was not about a daze at all. It happened in the quiet, unwitnessed hours, at 5 in the morning during a workout no one saw, during a difficult client call he pushed through without complaint, during a solitary dinner he cooked and ate without reaching for his phone to fill the silence. Marcus Aurelius wrote that very little is needed to make a happy life, that it is all within a person's own thinking. This is not abstract comfort. It is a practical instruction. Build a life whose value does not depend on witnesses, whose peace does not depend on company, whose worth does not depend on external validation of any kind. A man who can sit alone in a quiet apartment on a Friday night and feel genuinely at peace, not performing contentment for social media, not distracting himself into numbness, but actually at peace, has built something almost nobody around him possesses. This is the man Adaze eventually encountered again, nearly 8 months after she had walked away. Julian did not orchestrate the meeting. Life simply placed them at the same gathering, and she watched a version of him that no longer scanned the room for her approval, no longer adjusted his posture or his conversation hoping to be noticed. A man fully occupied by his own life, warm but not desperate, friendly but not performing. She would later admit, in a conversation that no longer carried any urgency for either of them, that she had spent months wondering about the man behind the rumors she kept hearing, and that meeting him again confirmed something she had not expected to feel: regret, quiet and unspoken, for underestimating what he would become once given the space to become it. Whether or not they ever reconciled is almost beside the point of this story. What matters is that Julian no longer needed her regret to feel complete. He simply noticed it, the way a king notices weather passing outside his window, present, real, but no longer capable of determining the temperature inside his own home. What made this final transformation possible was not any single dramatic decision but the slow accumulation of hundreds of small, unwitnessed choices, made on ordinary evenings when no one was watching and nothing external was pushing him toward growth. Diogenes famously told Alexander the Great, the most powerful man in the known world, to simply step out of his sunlight, because Diogenes wanted nothing Alexander had to offer. That kind of contentment is not born from a single revelation. It is built, quietly, meal by meal, workout by workout, evening by evening, until a man arrives at a place where very little outside himself has the power to disturb his peace. Julian did not wake up one morning transformed. He built the transformation the same way a mason builds a wall, one deliberate stone placed after another, most of them invisible individually, all of them essential collectively. This is the truth beneath every principle in this video. There is no shortcut to becoming a man loneliness cannot diminish. There is only the daily, unglamorous discipline of choosing yourself, again and again, until one day you notice the choosing has become who you simply are. Principle 9. Never return to renegotiate your worth. There is a specific temptation that arrives once a man has done real work on himself. The temptation to return, message in hand, evidence of his transformation ready to present, hoping the new version of him will finally earn what the old version could not. This is a trap disguised as closure. Machiavelli warned that a prince who reveals his strength too early, before circumstances favor him, often hands his advantage directly to his rival. Returning uninvited to showcase your growth is not confidence. It is still, underneath the muscle and the discipline and the new vocabulary, the same old hunger for her approval, simply wearing a more impressive outfit. A king does not campaign for reinstatement. If a door reopens, it reopens on its own, through her genuine curiosity or circumstance, not through a persuasive pitch you have rehearsed in the mirror. Julian felt this pull strongly around month 6, convinced that if Adès could simply see the consistency he had built, the calm he had cultivated, she would understand what she had walked away from. He drafted a message 3 separate times, each one a careful blend of humility and quiet triumph, and each time he deleted it before sending, recognizing the same old desperation hiding beneath more sophisticated language. The growth he had built was not a presentation prepared for an audience of one. It was simply who he had become, regardless of whether she ever witnessed it directly. This is perhaps the hardest principle of all, because it asks you to build something extraordinary and then resist the urge to announce it to the one person whose reaction you most want to witness. True transformation does not need her acknowledgement to be real. It was real the moment you built it, whether or not she ever finds out. The final word. Disappearing like a king is not about punishment, and it was never about her. It is about redirecting every ounce of attention you once spent monitoring someone else's feelings back toward the construction of your own life. Silence becomes a throne when it stops being a strategy and starts being the natural result of a man too occupied with his own becoming to perform grief for an audience. Your worth was never hers to determine, and it is not determined by whether she eventually notices what she lost. Rebuild your body, because discipline is the foundation everything else rests upon. Reveal less, because mystery is simply the natural residue of a man no longer performing for spectators. Detach from outcomes you cannot control, and attach entirely to the discipline you can. Rebuild your circle, because no king rules alone, and isolation only amplifies the very insecurities you are trying to heal. Let time speak where your words would only confirm your availability. And finally, become the man who is whole even in the empty, unwitnessed hours, because that is the only version of wholeness that cannot be taken from you by anyone who chooses to leave. If Julian's story, or the principles woven through it, gave you even one new way to see your own situation, subscribe to Quotes Library right now. This channel is built entirely for men doing exactly what you are doing, sitting with ancient wisdom long enough to let it reshape a modern life. We release new stories, new frameworks, and new philosophy regularly, and every subscriber tells us this work is reaching the people it was built for. Share this with someone who needs to hear it tonight. Leave a comment about which principle hit hardest. And when you are ready to close this video and step back into your own life, do it the way a king would, quietly, deliberately, without needing anyone's permission to begin. Keep becoming.